On the morning of September 14th, 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte stood on a low hill outside Moscow and waited for the city to surrender. Behind him stood half of Europe under his command. In front of him lay the third largest city on the continent, the ancient religious capital of the Russian Empire. His army had marched more than 800 miles to reach this exact view. Every campaign he had ever fought had ended the same way. The enemy capital fell, the enemy sovereign asked for peace, and Napoleon dictated the terms. He was waiting for the same ritual he had performed in Vienna, in Berlin, in Madrid. A delegation of Russian nobles was supposed to walk out through the city gates carrying the keys of Moscow on a velvet cushion. That was how European wars ended. The delegation never came. His scouts rode back with an unsettling report. The city was silent. No soldiers, no officials, no priests. Almost no people at all. 200,000 residents had already vanished. What remained inside the walls, one French officer wrote, was a ghost town. Stray dogs, foreign merchants, and prisoners who had been let out of jail on purpose. Napoleon rode into the empty capital. Within 48 hours, Moscow was on fire. Not a small fire, not an accident. Thousands of wooden houses, tens of thousands of shops, churches, and palaces. Nearly 3/4 of Moscow burned in a coordinated, deliberate operation the Russians themselves had planned. They had burned their own holy city rather than let him keep it. Why would a country do that? Why would any state in any century burn its own cities to the ground rather than let them fall? What kind of calculation ends with a nation setting fire to its own history? To understand that calculation, we have to go back much further than 1812. Because the strategy that broke Napoleon did not begin in Russia. It began on the open steppes more than 2,000 years earlier with a Persian king who thought he was chasing a war he could win. In the summer of 513 BCE, King Darius I of Persia crossed the Danube River at the head of an army that the Greek historian Herodotus, in his usual style, described as vast beyond counting. Modern estimates put the real figure somewhere between 70 and 80,000 men, still an enormous force for the ancient world, projected by an empire that stretched from Egypt to the borders of India. Darius had come to punish the Scythians. The Scythians were nomadic tribes who ranged across the grasslands north of the Black Sea, mounted archers, herders, raiders. Darius intended to bring them under Persian rule, the way he had brought so many other peoples find their army. Defeat it in a set-piece battle, take their capital, install a governor. That was the Persian playbook. Except the Scythians did not have a capital, and they refused to give him a battle. Whenever the Persian army approached the Scythians, simply retreated deeper into the steppe. But they did not retreat empty-handed. As they went, they poisoned the wells. They burned the grazing grass. They drove off the herds. They left nothing for the Persian horses. No water, no food, no forage. Darius chased phantoms across an empty land, watching his supplies dwindle in territory that offered him nothing to steal. Eventually, he turned back. He had conquered nothing, gained nothing, and lost tens of thousands of men to hunger, thirst, and heat. This is the earliest historical example we have of what military theorists would eventually call scorched earth, the deliberate destruction of your own resources to deny them to an invader. But the Scythian version was primitive. It worked because the Scythians had almost nothing to lose. They had no cities to burn, no harvests to abandon. Their entire civilization was mobile. The version with real cost, real sacrifice, and real cities in flames would take another 5 centuries to appear. And when it did, it appeared in a place no one expected. Not in the wilderness, in the middle of ancient Gaul. In the early spring of 52 BCE, Vercingetorix, a young Gallic chieftain and leader of a tribe called the Arverni, stood before a council of the tribes of central Gaul. He made an argument that must have sounded to his own people like insanity. For 6 years, Julius Caesar's legions had been grinding through Gaul. They had crushed every open-field army the Gauls could put in front of them. They had stormed every fortified town they chose to besiege. Roman siege engineering was, at that moment, the most advanced military technology on Earth. Roman logistics, the mule trains, the granaries, the depots, allowed those legions to fight year after year, far from home. Vercingetorix understood something most of his allies did not. The Gauls could not beat Rome in open battle. They could not out-engineer Rome at siegecraft. Their only weapon, the only thing Caesar could not manufacture himself, was the food Gaul grew. Take away that food, and Caesar's army would starve before it could conquer anything. So Vercingetorix proposed the unthinkable. Burn the towns, burn the granaries, burn the villages, the barns, the mills, everything. Empty the countryside. Turn Gaul into a desert. Let Caesar march through a country that fed no one. And astonishingly, the tribes agreed. In a single day, they set fire to more than 20 of their own towns in the territory of a people called the Bituriges. Caesar's own memoirs recorded in something close to stunned detail. For the first time in his Gallic campaign, his legions started to go hungry. But then came the plea. There was one city the Bituriges could not bring themselves to burn. It was called Avaricum, modern Bourges, in central France, and it was their finest settlement. Ancient and wealthy, it was ringed by the massive timber and stone walls the Gauls called Murus Gallicus. When the moment came to torch it, the elders dropped to their knees before Vercingetorix and begged him to spare it. He hesitated, and then he agreed. Caesar noticed immediately. He marched on Avaricum, he besieged it, he took it. Inside, the Romans found the grain reserves that saved the Roman campaign, enough to feed the legions through the rest of the season. Then, in his usual fashion, Caesar killed almost every one of the roughly 40,000 people trapped inside the walls. Fewer than 1,000 survived. The lesson would echo for 2,000 years. Scorched earth does not fail when it is too harsh. It fails when it is not harsh enough. It requires absolute discipline. No exceptions, no favorites, no cities too beautiful to burn. The moment a defender flinches, the invader eats. For 18 centuries after Avaricum, this remained what military historians call an asymmetric doctrine. It was the strategy of the weaker side. The side that could not win a stand-up fight, could not defend a fortress, could not outmaneuver the enemy. Its power lay in a single grim calculation. The invader's army has to eat. If you can starve his army, you can beat him without ever facing his line. But the doctrine had a threshold. It only worked at scale. The country being defended had to be enormous, vast enough that the invader ran out of food before he ran out of territory to advance through. It had to have terrible roads and a punishing climate so that resupply from home became impossible. And it had to have a government willing to sacrifice its own subjects on a scale that European monarchs, throughout most of history, considered unthinkable. In 1812, one country in the world checked every box. That country was Russia. Russia was so large that a French army could march for 2 months without leaving Russian territory. Russia's roads, if you could call them roads, dissolved into mud in autumn and hardened into iron in winter. Russia had a government, the autocratic empire of Tsar Alexander I, with the absolute authority to command anything, including the destruction of its own cities if the ministers of the Tsar decided it was necessary. All Russia needed was an invasion large enough to make the doctrine worth using. That invasion came on the 24th of June, 1812. That morning, Napoleon Bonaparte led the largest army ever assembled in European history across the Neman River on the western border of the Russian Empire. His Grande Armée, a coalition of Frenchmen, Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutch, and dozens of subject nationalities, numbered roughly 615,000 men across all echelons. There was no formal declaration of war. Napoleon did not think he needed one. He was, at that moment, the master of Europe. His plan was straightforward. Push east, force the Russian armies into a decisive battle, crush them. Then dictate peace to Tsar Alexander from a captured Russian city, probably Vilnius, possibly Smolensk. He did not expect to have to march all the way to Moscow. He did not expect the war to last more than a few months. Every one of those assumptions was wrong. The Russians had a different plan. They never announced it, and it was never written down in a single document. It emerged painfully from a confused argument inside the Russian High Command between the Tsar, his generals, and the political court in St. Petersburg. But its shape was already forming as Napoleon's columns crossed the Neman. The Russian field armies would not stand and fight. They would retreat. And behind them, as they retreated, they would begin to destroy their own country. The man given the task of running this retreat was a Baltic-born general named Barclay de Tolly. He was intelligent, methodical, and deeply unpopular. Russian aristocrats considered him too foreign, too cold, too willing to give up sacred ground without a fight. That, of course, was exactly why he had been chosen. For weeks, through July and into August, Barclay's armies pulled back first from the border, then from Vilnius, then from every stronghold the Tsar's ministers had once assumed would hold. As they retreated, they burned. They set fire to supply depots. They emptied grain magazines and torched what they could not carry. Peasants were ordered to drive off livestock and destroy the standing crops in their fields. Napoleon's columns kept advancing into a country that was actively erasing itself in front of them. Villages were empty by the time the French arrived. Wells were poisoned. Bridges lay broken behind fleeing Russian cavalry. By the middle of August, Napoleon was frustrated, but not yet worried. He was closing on the first real Russian city he had seen since crossing the Neman, the ancient walled town of Smolensk. It was an important religious center on the road to Moscow, and the perfect place, he thought, to force a battle and end the campaign. The battle happened on the 16th and 17th of August. It was brutal, indecisive, and from the Russian point of view, beside the point. When Barclay's army pulled out of the city on the night of the 17th, they did to Smolensk what they had done to the villages behind them. They set fire to the powder magazines. They burned the bridges. They torched the wooden districts. Then they retreated further east, leaving Napoleon a city of smoke and stone. Napoleon walked through the ruins the next morning. He had marched over 500 miles to capture Smolensk. Smolensk was no longer a city. There were no supplies. There were no winter quarters. There was nothing left to hold. He had a decision to make. He could stop there, dig in for the winter, and consolidate his position. Or he could keep marching deeper into Russia, further from his supply lines toward the only prize big enough to force Tsar Alexander to the negotiating table. He kept marching. He decided to take Moscow. That decision, more than any other, killed the Grande Armée. Ahead waited a battle that would kill more men in a single day than most European wars killed in a decade. A council of Russian generals in a peasant hut, and a governor of Moscow who had been quietly preparing for exactly this moment. For nearly 3 weeks after Smolensk, Napoleon's army pushed east through country that had been picked clean. Peasant villages had been abandoned. Grain fields had been trampled or burned. What Napoleon needed was what he had always needed: a Russian army that would stand in his path and let him destroy it. On the 7th of September, roughly 75 miles west of Moscow, near a village called Borodino, the Russians finally gave him that battle. It was one of the bloodiest single days in the history of warfare up to that point. Roughly 250,000 men fought across a landscape of grain fields and small woods for 12 hours of unrelenting close-range combat. Cannons fired at ranges of less than 100 meters. Cavalry charges collapsed into hand-to-hand melees. By nightfall, roughly 73,000 men on both sides were dead or wounded, the equivalent of a small modern city wiped off the map in a single afternoon. Napoleon called it a French victory. In the narrow technical sense, it was one. The Russians pulled back from the field, Napoleon controlled the ground. But it was a victory that gave him almost nothing. He had failed to destroy the Russian army. Whole corps had disengaged in good order and were already marching east under the command of a new Russian commander-in-chief. That commander was a heavy-set, one-eyed field marshal named Mikhail Kutuzov. He had replaced the unpopular Barclay de Tolly a few weeks earlier, appointed under intense political pressure from a Russian aristocracy that wanted a Russian name in command and a Russian battle. Kutuzov gave them their battle at Borodino. Now he was going to give them something they were not prepared for. 6 days after Borodino, on the 13th of September, Kutuzov called his generals to a peasant log cabin in a village called Fili, just west of Moscow. Every senior officer in the Russian army crowded into that room. The stove smoked. The generals argued. Most of them wanted a second battle, a defense of Moscow itself. Moscow was the ancient capital. It was the religious heart of Russia. Abandoning it, they said, was politically impossible. The Tsar would not survive it. The people would not forgive it. Kutuzov listened. He was old, he was tired, and his critics said he was a coward. He waited until each general had finished. Then he said the sentence that has been engraved into every Russian history book since. With the loss of Moscow, Russia was not lost. He ordered the army to abandon the city. Kutuzov's biographers have spent 2 centuries arguing about what he actually meant that night. Was he simply saving his army from a second Borodino? Was he executing a deliberate long-term plan to draw Napoleon into a trap? Was he improvising under pressure? The answer most likely is some of all 3. What matters is what his decision authorized. It authorized the abandonment of Moscow. And by authorizing that abandonment, it turned the city over to a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. His name was Count Fyodor Rostopchin. He was the Governor-General of Moscow, an aristocratic hardliner with a mustache that seems, in his surviving portraits, permanently curled in disdain. He was, by every account, a difficult man. Xenophobic, furious, obsessed with what he saw as a French moral contamination creeping through Russian society. Above everything else, he was a Russian nationalist of a feverish, almost fanatical intensity that most of the European nobility of his generation found alarming. Rostopchin had spent the summer of 1812 doing 2 things at once. In public, he printed patriotic broadsheets, colorful pamphlets urging Moscow's residents to fight the French with pitchforks and kitchen knives. In private, he was disassembling his own city. He began by evacuating the government offices, then the treasury, then the state archives, then the historic religious icons of the Kremlin cathedrals. By the time Kutuzov's council at Fili had decided to abandon Moscow, Rostopchin had already moved out roughly 200,000 of the city's residents, an evacuation on a scale no European city had ever attempted. He also ordered the removal of every one of Moscow's 96 municipal fire pumps. That number is worth pausing on. 96 pumps represented Moscow's entire mechanical firefighting capacity, every engine, every hose cart, every water carriage. Rostopchin ordered them dismantled, loaded onto wagons, and driven east out of the city. He did not do this because he was afraid the French might damage them. He did it because he did not want them there when the fires started. Because he was planning fires. The details came out only later, through Russian archival documents, pieced together by historians in the 20th century, and through Rostopchin's own defensive attempts years afterward to change the story. He had assembled a team. It was led by a Moscow police superintendent named Voronenko, whose official job was to keep order in the mercantile district. His real assignment, during the final week before the French arrived, was to coordinate a network of police officers and hand-picked convicts released from Moscow's prisons. Rostopchin had opened the doors of the city jails. He had freed hundreds of prisoners on the explicit condition that they take incendiary devices, chemical fuses, torches, kegs of flammable liquid, and distribute them through the warehouses, wooden district, and grain depots of Moscow. Then they were to wait. When the French arrived, Voronenko would give the order. The fires would begin. This is the part of the popular story that has been quietly wrong for 200 years. The popular image of scorched earth is a spontaneous, primitive, panicked act, an army in retreat setting things on fire as it flees. That is not what this was. What Rostopchin ran in Moscow in September 1812 was a systematic administrative operation. Fire pumps evacuated, prisoners recruited, fuses distributed, a police superintendent assigned, a specific ignition plan coordinated by district. Scorched earth at scale is not chaos. It is state capacity turned against a city's own body. And on the afternoon of the 14th of September, that operation went live. Napoleon rode into Moscow through the empty gates that afternoon. His generals were relieved. Winter quarters, they thought. Real shelter. Real food if there was any to be found. Above all, an end to the campaign. Napoleon settled into the Kremlin, the ancient stone fortress at the heart of the city, and sat down to draft a letter to Tsar Alexander proposing terms of peace. The first fires broke out that same evening. They started in the merchant quarter known as the Kitaygorod, along the banks of the Yaouza River, exactly where Voronenko's men had been most active. French officers initially assumed it was accidental. Grande Armée soldiers had been foraging in abandoned houses. Someone they thought had knocked over a lamp. They were wrong. By dawn on the 15th, fires had broken out in 5 separate districts at the same time, a pattern no accidental cause could produce. That morning, an equinoctial gale began to blow in from the northeast. The wind was ferocious. Moscow was a city of wooden houses, wooden shops, and wooden boardwalks. More than 70% of its structures had been built from resinous northern pine, and there was no way to fight the fires. The pumps were gone. Within 24 hours, the wind and the arson had merged into a single firestorm. It rolled through the city in walls of flame that reached, according to eyewitnesses, hundreds of feet into the air. Iron cracked, stone glowed. Ash fell like snow across the Kremlin walls. This is where the popular version of the story falls apart most completely. For nearly 2 centuries, French and Russian propagandists blamed each other for the fire. French accounts insisted the Russians had done it. Russian accounts, wanting to preserve the image of Moscow's destruction as a divine or spontaneous act of national resistance, blamed drunken French looters and accidental sparks. Neither side was quite honest. In truth, French troops spent the next 4 days desperately trying to save the city. Moscow was their shelter, their food, and their entire logistical base for the coming winter. They had every reason to want it standing. They had almost no capacity to save it. The pumps were on wagons 200 miles east. The arsonists were still moving through the streets in the dark, lighting new fires the moment old ones died down. Napoleon watched the fire spread from a Kremlin window on the evening of the 15th. His master of horse, a former ambassador to Russia named Armand de Caulaincourt, stood beside him. Caulaincourt would later write in his memoirs that the fire was, in his own words, the most grand and most terrifying spectacle of his life. That night, he also understood something Napoleon did not want to understand. The fires were not an accident. They were a policy. The Russians had chosen to burn their capital rather than let him keep it. By the morning of the 16th, the Kremlin itself was in danger. Sparks were falling on the roofs of the powder magazines, enough gunpowder stored inside the ancient fortress walls to level everything for a mile around. Napoleon evacuated on foot through streets of burning timber, his boots scorched and his uniform black with smoke. He fled to the Petrovsky Palace on the outskirts of the city. From a suburban balcony, he watched Moscow burn for 4 days. When he finally returned to the Kremlin a week later, once the fires had begun to burn themselves out, he returned to a ruin. More than 6,500 of Moscow's 9,000 residential houses had been destroyed, roughly 70% of the city's dwellings, along with 8,000 shops. In most districts, what remained were blackened stone shells and chimneys pointing at the sky like broken teeth. Napoleon wrote to Tsar Alexander proposing peace. Alexander did not reply. He wrote again. Again silence. He waited. Through the last weeks of September and the first 2 weeks of October, Napoleon sat in a half-burned Kremlin surrounded by an army that was running out of food. His scouts brought back the same report every day. The Russian armies were not disintegrating. They were not asking for terms. They were growing stronger, reinforced by fresh troops arriving from the interior of the empire and fed by supply lines running through provinces the French had never touched. Something was becoming clear to Napoleon that he had not fully grasped before. The rules he understood, the European rules, the rules that had governed war between civilized states since the 17th century, did not apply here. In a European war, when your capital fell, you sued for peace. That was the whole point of capitals. But the Russians had watched their capital burn, and their answer was silence. Alexander did not need to save Moscow. He had already decided that Moscow was expendable. What he needed to save was the Russian army. And the Russian army was growing stronger by the week. Napoleon had a decision to make. He could stay in Moscow through the winter. But there was no food. There was almost no shelter. The scorched earth zone surrounding the city stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. His supply columns were arriving smaller and smaller as Cossack raiders picked them apart on the roads. He could march south into unravaged provinces and find food. But that would mean fighting Kutuzov's army in territory Kutuzov had chosen, a battle Kutuzov would happily give him on Kutuzov's terms. Or he could go home. On the 19th of October, he chose the third option. He gave the order to evacuate Moscow. The Grande Armée, what was left of it, roughly 100,000 effective soldiers, began the march west, back the way it had come. Standing in the courtyard of the Kremlin that October morning, Napoleon did not yet understand what he had ordered. The retreat would kill more of his soldiers than any battle he ever fought, because the country they were about to cross was the country their enemies had been carefully, patiently preparing for them. The march west was not war. It was starvation with a road. Napoleon's route home ran through the same country his army had crossed in the summer, the same country the Russians had been methodically scorching for 4 months. There was no food. The villages were empty or burned. The forage was gone. Whatever supplies the French carried in their wagons had to last for 600 miles. Cossack cavalry appeared along the flanks of the retreating column almost immediately. They did not offer battle. They picked off stragglers. They cut supply carts loose. They killed the men and horses that fell behind. Every day, the column grew shorter. The first snow fell in early November. By the end of the month, temperatures had dropped to 20 degrees below freezing at night. Men who had marched east in the summer heat wearing parade uniforms now had no winter clothing. They wrapped themselves in curtains looted from burned houses. They boiled the leather from their belts. They ate horse meat first, from horses that had already died, then from horses that were still working. The rearguard actions at the Berezina River in late November have been remembered as one of the great feats of military discipline in European history. French engineers built pontoon bridges under fire to carry the surviving Grande Armée across a half-frozen river. That is not wrong, but it obscures the underlying arithmetic. By the time Napoleon crossed the Berezina, his army was already broken. The Berezina was where he counted the bodies. By the time the last remnants of the Grande Armée crossed back over the Neman River in mid-December, the same border they had crossed in triumph 6 months earlier, fewer than 10,000 effective combat troops remained. The rest, more than 600,000 men, were dead, captured, deserted, or missing. And here is the part of the story that has been quietly misunderstood for 200 years. Everyone remembers General Winter. Every schoolbook illustration shows French soldiers freezing in the snow. Tchaikovsky wrote an entire overture about it. The freezing was real, the frostbite, the frozen river, the horses collapsing on the ice. But the arithmetic tells a different story. By the time the first frost hit in late October, the frost that gets all the credit for destroying Napoleon's army, more than half of the Grande Armée had already been lost. They had died in the summer. They had died during the advance before Borodino, before Moscow. They died from typhus in overcrowded field camps, from dysentery caused by bad water, from Cossack raids on foraging parties, from thirst in provinces where the wells had been poisoned, and above all, from starvation in territory the Russians had systematically emptied of food. Winter finished what was left, but scorched earth had done most of the killing months earlier under the summer sun. That is the doctrine at work. That is what state-run devastation looks like when it succeeds. An army does not have to be shot to lose a war. It only has to be starved. 20 years after the retreat, a Prussian officer who had served in Napoleon's Russian campaign, but on the other side, as a volunteer with the Russian army, sat down in Berlin to write a treatise on the theoretical nature of war. His name was Karl von Clausewitz. His book, On War, would become the most influential work of military theory ever written in the Western tradition. When Clausewitz examined the campaign of 1812, he was blunt. Napoleon's defeat, he wrote, was not a failure of tactics, morale, or climate. It was a failure of subsistence. The Russian government had remained firm. The Russian people had not lost heart. And the retreat and devastation of the country, in his phrase, had deprived the enemy of every possibility of supply. That was the doctrine stated cleanly. Scorched earth becomes a war-winning strategy when it is coordinated by a state that will not flinch, executed on a continental scale, and directed against an army too far from home to survive on its own logistics. Every element has to be present. Remove any one of them, and the doctrine collapses into a war crime committed against your own citizens. Which is exactly what happened 126 years later in a Chinese provincial capital called Changsha. The Second Sino-Japanese War is not a war most viewers in the West know well. It began in the summer of 1937 with the Japanese invasion of northern China. Over the next 8 years, it would kill somewhere between 15 and 20 million Chinese people. By the autumn of 1938, the war had gone catastrophically for the nationalist Chinese government of Chiang Kai-shek. The Japanese had captured Shanghai. They had captured Nanjing, where they committed one of the worst massacres of the 20th century. They had captured Wuhan, the industrial heart of Chinese resistance. Chiang was running out of country to retreat into. He turned deliberately to the doctrine Clausewitz had described. His slogan for it, Jiao Tu Kang Zhang, translates roughly as scorched earth resistance. The policy, in the words of his own military council, was to leave not a single blade of grass or tree behind to aid the enemy. Chiang's strategy, borrowed almost consciously from the Russian precedent of 1812, was to trade space for time. He would give up cities. He would give up factories. He would give up entire provinces if that was what it took to draw the Japanese army deep into a country whose vastness would eventually exhaust it. That was the plan. On the 12th of November 1938, it went wrong in one specific city in a way that would haunt Chinese memory for the rest of the 20th century. The city was Changsha. It was the provincial capital of Hunan, about 200 miles south of Wuhan, an ancient walled city of roughly 1 million people, and one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. Chinese nationalist forces had methodically prepared it for destruction. Kerosene stockpiles had been placed at intersections. Arson squads had been briefed. The garrison commander, a general named Feng Jian, kept an authorization in his desk to burn Changsha the moment Japanese forces reached the Miluo River, just north of the city. Except the Japanese never reached the Miluo. A false report claimed they had. Somewhere in the confusion, a Chinese sentry mistook something a distant fire, a friendly patrol. No one is quite sure for a Japanese vanguard. The report reached the garrison in the middle of the night, on the 13th of November. Feng Jian panicked. He gave the order without sounding an evacuation alarm, without warning the residents, without checking whether the report was accurate. Arson squads moved through the sleeping city with torches and kerosene. 90% of Changsha burned to the ground over the next 48 hours. Somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people died, mostly civilians, trapped in their beds. Most were women, children, and the elderly, because many able-bodied men had already been evacuated or drafted into the army. The Japanese, meanwhile, were still miles away. They arrived weeks later and found the ashes of a city that had destroyed itself for nothing. Popular memory has long framed the Changsha fire as an accident, a chaotic tragedy caused by frightened civilians or careless soldiers. It was not. It was a deliberately authorized state operation, executed under a documented military doctrine. It went catastrophically wrong because the intelligence was false, and the political leadership had built no fail-safes. Chiang Kai-shek's government executed 3 officers, including Feng Jian, for the disaster. But that did not restore the doctrine's credibility. Changsha became in Chinese memory a permanent argument against total scorched earth as state policy, and a permanent reminder of what happens when its discipline fails. Rostopchin in 1812 had gotten his fires right. Feng Jian in 1938 had gotten them wrong. The line between them was drawn by the discipline of the state that ordered the burning. Scorched earth requires the coldness of central planning. Without that coldness, it kills its own citizens for nothing and hands the enemy a city he might never have taken by force. 3 years after Changsha, in July of 1941, the doctrine reached its most industrial expression yet. Nazi Germany had invaded the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, opening a front more than 1,000 miles long. German panzer divisions were advancing 60 miles a day. On the 3rd of July, Joseph Stalin gave a radio address to the Soviet people. He ordered a comprehensive scorched earth policy across every retreating zone. Bridges were to be blown, grain burned, livestock evacuated, industrial equipment dismantled and shipped east. The resulting evacuation of factories would eventually move more than 1,000 major industrial plants across the Ural Mountains before the year was over. By November, the Soviet Military Command had issued a more specific instruction, Order 0428. It directed the systematic incineration of every settlement within 40 to 60 kilometers of the German front line. The goal was explicit: Deny the Wehrmacht winter shelter. Freeze them in the open. The doctrine worked. Not cleanly, not without immense cost to the Soviet civilian population, which paid the price for having its own villages burned by its own state. But the German advance stopped. Moscow held. The war entered a new phase. And it entered that phase because, as in 1812, as Clausewitz had written a century earlier, a country large enough, cold enough, and administered by a government hard enough had used its own body as a weapon against an invader. Stalin was not a subtle student of history, but he had read Clausewitz. He knew exactly what he was doing. This is what scorched earth is once you strip away the imagery. It is not a barbaric spasm. It is not a primitive last resort. It is a rational, sustained, administratively difficult doctrine of state, available only to a specific kind of country under a specific kind of pressure. It requires vast territory. It requires a punishing climate. It requires a central government with the authority to destroy its own subjects' property, and the political discipline to do so without making exceptions. And it requires a specific kind of invader, one whose army is larger than his supply lines can feed, and who has to eat the country in order to conquer it. When those conditions align on the steppes of Scythia, in the fields of Gaul and the wooden capital of Russia, or in the villages between Moscow and the Wehrmacht, the doctrine can defeat a numerically or technologically superior enemy without ever winning a battle. When they do not align, a false alarm in Hunan, a panicked garrison commander, a burning city with the enemy still miles away, the doctrine kills its own citizens for nothing. That is the terrifying calculation behind the question in the title of this video. Not simply why defenders sometimes burn their own cities, but why some states decide that a burned city, on the defender's terms, is more valuable than a standing city on the enemy's terms. It is a decision about what a nation is. Is a nation a collection of buildings, streets and monuments, physical objects a foreign army can occupy and hold? Or is a nation something beneath those buildings, something that survives the burning? In 1812, the Russian state decided in effect that Moscow was a building, and Russia was something else. Which brings us back one last time to a hill outside Moscow on the afternoon of the 14th of September, 1812. Napoleon expected keys on a velvet cushion. He got an empty city and a fire. He expected the ritual of European conquest, the ceremony of surrender, the exchange of diplomatic terms, the treaty that would let him return to Paris in triumph. He got silence from a czar who had already decided that a burned capital was cheaper than a captured empire. Napoleon never fully understood it. In his writings after the war, during his exile on Elba, and later on St. Helena, he kept returning to the Russian campaign with a kind of stunned bewilderment. He blamed the winter. He blamed the distances. He blamed his marshals. He never quite acknowledged that he had lost to a doctrine, an idea about how a state could weaponize its own territory that no European sovereign of his generation was prepared to counter. What broke the Grande Armée was not fire. Fire was only the visible part. What broke the Grande Armée was the strategic decision made in a peasant hut by a one-eyed field marshal and confirmed in the palaces of St. Petersburg, that Russia could survive without Moscow, but Napoleon could not survive without a treaty. Scorched earth is the doctrine of last calculations. It is the choice a nation makes when it decides that its ashes, kept, are worth more than its cities surrendered. Sometimes that calculation is right, and an empire collapses in the snow of the retreat. Sometimes it is horrifically wrong, and 30,000 civilians die in their sleep because of a rumor. Every time it happens, someone has to stand in the ruins the next morning and count what the fire cost. That someone in 1812 was Napoleon. It would not be the last time.